Hey guys, Iron Wolf here. Today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different than usual. I'll be actually doing a couple more videos like this in the future. It's just going to be me, talking about things related to Hyrule Conquest or sometimes even just Zelda in general. But today I want to talk about something in particular. I feel a bit funny saying this, but I want to talk about the meta in Hyrule Conquest. So I don't know. I feel like using the word meta isn't the right word because the game is so new and it's still in such early phases that there's not a lot about it yet that you can call meta, I suppose. But there's still, you want to know what's good and what's not in the current version of the game. I consider that, technically that's the meta. So I want to talk about some things with that. Mainly talk about all the factions, like where they stand in comparison to others, and as well as their pros and cons. So like this is where they are on like a tier list type thing, and then this is my reason why I put them in this tier or in this tier, etc., etc. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit today. So I have a little thing here, a little notepad. Just I jotted down some notes talking about, the pros and cons of the different factions. So I separated the six factions into three tiers. Each tier has two factions in it. So there's the high tier, the mid tier, and the low tier. I'll start off with the high tier and work my way down. So first off, on the high tier, the faction that I believe is the best in the game right now in version 0.3 is the Kokiri. The Kokiri, they have a lot going for them. There's not a lot of weaknesses that they have, and the ones that they do have are significantly overshadowed by their strengths. So I'll start talking about the pros, and then I'll go into the cons of the Kokiri later. So the Kokiri have probably the best economy in the entire game. So not only are their workers like really efficient and really good, but all their buildings are very cheap. Market groves only cost 100 resources, and from one market grove, you're basically getting 3 buildings of your choice. So that's really handy to have. And so not only do they get to save resources for these cheap buildings, but their upgrades, like the Market Grove upgrades, like if you turn it into a home or a storehouse or a fairgrounds, etc., that doesn't cost anything. So you're saving a lot of resources. So that their high economy and their cheap buildings is something really important to note. Another thing too, they are tied for having the best early game with the Goma. Their early game is very, very strong, and when I say early game, I mean everything up until between 10 to 15 minutes. That's what I consider the early game in Hyrule Conquest. So they're tied for the best early game in the entire game. They might have the slight edge on the Goma, just because of their economy is stronger. But they're so good at being able to get really strong units out early and put pressure on your opponent within those first 15 minutes of the game. So what I mean by this is, at about 5 or 6 minutes, the Kokiri can start pumping out Deku trees if they're using Saria. Having these units out in a match this early is very, very strong. They have 1,000 health, they're very tanky, they do great damage, you can garrison range units inside of them. Very good unit. Having it out that early is very, very scary if you're fighting against a Kokiri player. Not only that, but they're able to mass a huge amount of slingers and even Minutemen uh, in the early phases of the game, and that they have this giant, massive swarm of Deku trees, slingers, and some Minutemen thrown in there, and with the Saria thrown in there too, giving her aura buff to the slingers, that becomes a very scary army to deal with. So their early game is very good, and that leads me into what I call the best transition. Now this might be a little weird to explain, but basically when you are transferring from like the mid game to the early game and from the early game to the late game, you've kind of like that transition is kind of like, all right, now we've kind of gotten out of the early phases of the match. Let me start, like let's say with the Hylians, you finish your early game, you're like, you got your lookouts and your castle guards, and you're like, all right, I need to start getting knights, or I need to start teching up to tier 3, or I need to get cavalry, this, that, and the other. The Kokiri, they have a very strong mid game because their mid game and their early game are very much identical. Because their early game is so strong, and their mid game, I guess you could call them their mid game units, are kind of overshadowed by the strength of their early game units. Like, there's no reason you should waste resources and time to put towards these quote-unquote mid-game units, when you could put that towards more of your early game units because they are just as good and in some cases even better. For example, I think slingers are better than emerald archers. Now that's kind of a bold statement with the Kokiri at least. I think the slingers are better than emerald archers because they're cheaper, and mainly because of how cheap they are. When you combine them with Saria, you can have a much bigger force of slingers with Saria than you could having Emerald Archers with Saria, and so as a whole, that makes it a more valuable force. And of course, you always win Deku trees with this faction. It's just always a good thing to have. Another one of the pros that the Kokiri have is they have arguably one of the best heroes in the game, Saria. Not only does she allow them to build Deku trees, but her 25% attack speed buff to all ranged units is very good. It makes them attack so much faster. It makes their DPS almost insane for almost any ranged unit, especially slingers. Another pro of the Kokiri is that they have the best matchup spread in the game. They basically don't lose any matchups. All the matchups in the game are in their favor, or at least slightly in their favor. So that's always a good thing to have. Um, Another thing too, all their units have amazing DPS. A lot of their units are really glass cannony, and if you're using Saria, you can have the Deku trees to tank for you. So that gives you a good balance of glass cannons and like tank units. So that's really good. So I'll start talking about some of the cons here, as you see down here. So as you see right here, below average late game, their late game isn't terrible, but it is significantly overshadowed by, like, let's say the Zora or even the Hylians and sometimes even the Gorons. Their late game it isn't amazing. It's not like, oh my gosh, their late game is so bad, it's the worst thing ever. It's not that good. But it's definitely, if you're in the late game with the Kokiri, you can still definitely compete at a very good level, especially, with your high eco and whatnot. Another thing too that's kind of a con for the Kokiri, they have to constantly spend materials throughout the whole game to build bushes. It's not like they can just plop down a farm and just farm it for the rest of the game and not have to worry about it again. But you have to constantly be micromanaging, having your workers build more bushes so that you don't have idle workers standing around doing nothing, and you're always producing wood, and that costs resources. So that's kind of a disadvantage, or not even a disadvantage, it's just kind of an annoyance that you have to keep in mind and pay attention with when playing the Kokiri. Another thing too, they have really weak defenses and really weak siege units. Their defenses aren't amazing, but they're an aggressive or like an offensively based faction anyway, so it's not that big of a concern. Another thing too, this is kind of a con, but kind of not at the same time, low tankiness. That con is easily like overshadowed when you're using Saria, which you'll be using most of the time, because it gives you access to Deku trees. Like I said earlier, Deku trees are very good tank units. So you really only have to worry about low tankiness if you're using a hero that isn't Saria, which I wouldn't recommend to begin with. But if you are, you're gonna struggle with tankiness a lot of the time. So now I want to talk about the next faction, which is the Goma. The Goma are a very good faction, which is why I put them in the high tier. They have a lot of pros. They're a very aggressive faction. They're more aggressive than the Kokiri even. So some of their pros. They have an above average economy. It's not amazing. It's pretty solid. It's not bad. They've got a lot of good things going for them as far as their economy goes. So that's good. They have very strong early game. Like I mentioned when I was talking about the Kokiri, they're tied for having the strongest early game in the entire game. Some factions they can like rush to, defeat them in about 5 minutes even if you're doing a caretaker rush. Or if you're doing, a safer, more laid back, or not laid back, but just like a safer build like pincers and spinals. Even then, you can still have like big groups of Goma harassing your opponents at like 8 or 9 minutes, which is still very, very difficult to deal with as any faction really. Even the Kokiri. The Kokiri still beat it, but it's still, a big annoyance for the Kokiri. What else? Oh yeah, so they have the ability to be able to create large amounts of units in very short periods of time. And this is thanks to the eggs and Goma Queen mechanic. They're able to plant these eggs, put out larvae, and then have the larvae start upgrading. It gets units out really, really fast. It's very good for, getting these rushes out as fast as possible, which is what this faction is all about. They're all about rushing. They remind me a lot of the Zurich from Star Trek. Or I'm from Star Trek. What am I saying? I'm sorry, StarCraft. They're able to expand really easily. thanks to the hive nodes, you see here, easy expansions, hive nodes are really cheap and they let you expand your territory a lot, and also they give you a population boost, which is really nice. But that does lead into the next thing I was going to talk about, which is the population cap glitch. There is a glitch in the current version of the game with the Goma, where planting eggs with your Goma Queen will go past your population cap and ignore it, basically. Now, you can abuse this glitch. It's most likely going to get patched out in the future, but in the current version of the game, sure, you can abuse it. It's whatever. Just don't make it a crutch, so that when the new version comes out and it's most likely getting patched out, you won't be like losing every time because you were like relying on that, basically. Although even then, you don't want to abuse it too much, like in the current version, because then you won't be able to build any units from like buildings and stuff. Only eggs from your Goma Queen. So like if you had a Solarium, you can't build eggs, or if you're trying to build a hero, you can't build them because you're way over the population cap. But you know, it's still something to keep in mind if you're going for like a rush, like really early, and you just need to get a bunch of units out fast without wasting time building things. You can just feel free to abuse it, but just keep in mind it's probably going to get changed soon. Strong heroes. They have very strong heroes. All the Goma heroes are viable. Agatha is not viable in 1v1s, only in team games, but she is still she is probably the best team-based hero in the game. So all the heroes are viable in some way, shape, or form. And that leads to the next thing I was going to say. They are probably the best support faction in the game. So what this means is, in team games, having a Goma player on your side is putting you in a really good place. They're probably the best faction when it comes to like synergy with other factions in like 2v2s and whatnot. So they're a very, very good faction in that regard. And then lastly, they just have really good matchups across the board. The only matchup they lose is against the Kokiri, and even then it's like slightly, you know, not in their favor. So still very doable. But that's pretty much all the pros for the Goma. Let me move on and start talking about some of their cons. So cons. Much like the Kokiri, they have very weak defenses. Doesn't matter too much because you'll be mostly playing very aggressive with this faction, but just keep that in mind. Next, they have a very weak mid and late game. Now, when I say very weak, I mean probably the weakest in the game. They fall off really hard after about the first 15-14 minutes. Their mid game is nothing special, and their late game is just really overshadowed by some of the other factions. So, like, I would just keep that in mind when playing the Goma. That, you know, like, after, you know, your first couple rushes, you really need to, like, it's going to be very difficult for you to come back if your rushes failed and whatnot. Because with the Goma, you just want to abuse the fact that their early game is broken. So, just keep that in mind. Another one of their cons is that they rely a lot on their Goma Queen. Now, what this means is, their Goma Queen is their main unit provider for a majority of the game, especially during the early game. You're not going to have a Solarium up until maybe the mid game, sometimes the early game if you're, you know, you're playing more passive. But you need to watch out, because if your opponent's harassing you or raiding you and they come in there, rush in, kill your Goma Queen, and then get out, that is very, very difficult to come back with. In some cases, that's even GG, because that's such an economic and huge setback that you can't recover from that. So that unit is a gold mine. You cannot let that unit die in a lot of cases, and if that unit does die, it's very, very difficult. So that's kind of a con, is that that unit becomes a crutch for a majority of your early game. And then the last thing I want to talk about with them is, this is kind of a con, kind of not, but they're a very high risk, high reward faction. And what this means is a lot of their stuff is good, and you get a lot of reward out of, you know, abusing their really strong early game. But it's high risk in the sense that because their mid and late game is so weak, if your early game isn't working out, you're in a very bad place, if that makes sense. So basically, like, if your rushes fail and your opponent like survives through them and is able to, you know, push on into the, like, grind through them into the mid game, it's gonna be very difficult for you to like clutch out that W as the Goma player. So that's all there is for the high tiers. Let me move on to the mid tiers. Alright, so here we have the mid tiers. These are factions that are still very good, but they they're still slightly overshadowed by the Gom and the Kokiri, mainly in the sense that like they don't have such oppressive offense so early in the game, but they're still very good factions. They're just slightly less strong. So the first one I'm going to talk about is probably, I guess you could say, the third best faction in the game, but this it's whatever. They're a mid-tier faction. Is the Zora. The Zora are very good. They have probably the strongest mid-game of any of the factions right now. This is mainly due to how strong their towers and defenses are, as well as their mages. By the time you get to the mid game, they should have a really big army of mages and even spearmen and whatnot, and that's very scary to deal with as a lot of factions. Their late game is pretty good too. Their late game isn't bad at all. They have very strong late game, units and cavalry and siege units as well. So their late game is nothing to sleep on as well. They have a very strong economy, nowhere close to as strong as the Kokiri, but still better than let's say like the Goma. It's just a very strong economy, very good, very solid. Another pro of the Zora is magic damage. They are one of the few factions in the game that takes a lot from magic damage, and that's a very, very good thing to have, because a lot of factions don't really focus on having resistance to magic damage, unless you're playing, like another Zora player and they're using Ruto to give their units, the magic debuff or magic damage or debuff. But in a lot of cases, their magic damage is really nice. Their towers and town center use magic damage, and then of course a lot of their mages use it. It's just a very good thing that they have. Like I mentioned earlier, they have some of the best defenses in the game, with their towers and then even their town center, just very good. Especially the fact that they have magic damage as well. Most of their heroes are viable, which is a nice thing to have. It gives you a lot of options. 3 out of the 4 are viable. The Zora King, I would never recommend you use. He is not very good at all. He can be viable, but I would not recommend it at all personally. I would not recommend it. Another thing too, as I mentioned earlier, very strong siege units. Another nice thing about the Zora, they can travel on water. Always a nice thing to have. Being able to just go straight over the water is nice. And the last thing, they have a very solid matchup spread. What this means is, like, they don't lose any matchups super hard. Like, sure, they still lose to the Kokiri and the Goma, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad of a matchup at all. It's still very doable. It's still, like, I would say it's, like, a slight disadvantage for the Zora. Alright. So now I'll talk about the cons. So a lot of their units have low survivability, which is, it's not that bad. They're very glass cannony, but because of how high their DPS is, they make up for it. But low survivability with their units, something to keep in mind. They have a really weak early game. Their early game is not that strong at all. Mainly, but I mean, well, when I say weak early game, I mean they can't take advantage of, rushes and aggressive pressure very early in the game. They can still survive and do fine in the early game, which is why they have decent matchups against the Kokiri and the Goma, because they can survive, they have ways to survive those early game rushes. So, but, their early game isn't the strongest, so I would say that's, kind of a disadvantage of them. And then lastly, a lot of their units and buildings are a little on the expensive side. Because of their good economy, it makes up for it, but they do have very expensive buildings and whatnot. So the big thing about these mid-tier factions, as you may see, they don't have a lot of disadvantages, but a lot of their advantages just aren't as, like, super prevalent as the advantages that the Goma and the Kokiri have. So I'll move on to the next mid-tier faction, and that would be the Gerudo. The Gerudo are very good. They're basically, a more passive version of the Kokiri, if I were to put it into, like, perspective. They're still a very aggressive faction, but they do play a little more, patient and, calculated, and you gotta keep an eye out on what your opponent's doing and have more micro on your home base rather than your forward army and whatnot. So the Gerudo, some of their pros. They have a strong material-based economy. What this means is the Gerudo will always have a surplus of materials. Really good at gathering wood and stone. You'll always have a surplus of it, especially with your extra expansion that you get with this faction, with the standard build. They have a very strong early game. This is mainly due to, being able to expand very early. and set up that expansion near your opponent and start harassing with grunts and marauders very early, and having, like a forward base of operations in which you can stage harasses and raids on your opponent. Full-on expansion in Tier 1, this is very handy to have. The fact that they can build like basically a half town center without having to tech up for significantly cheaper than a town center is very nice, because it lets you be able to produce grunts and marauders basically right into your opponent's base if you're doing really smart, like if you're smart with your expanding. So that's a really nice thing to have. Another nice pro of the Gerudo is the loot mechanic. When the grunts and the marauders, when they kill enemy units, they'll generate rupees, which is nice. You don't have to have as many workers dedicated to rupees because of this, because you'll constantly be harassing and raiding with this faction, so you'll be getting rupees if you're doing it successfully. Their mid game isn't bad. It's pretty good. You can, as you start to hit the mid game, you can start getting cavalry and sand snipers out, and even start to go towards tier 3, and so you can work towards getting witches and whatnot. But their mid game isn't bad at all. It's pretty good. Their late game it's pretty average. I would say once you get the ice arrow archers and the witches, as well as a bunch of cavalry and sand snipers, they're pretty good. But it's nothing too, it's nothing amazing. It's not bad. It's not great. It's just very average. Let's see what else. All their heroes are viable. Let's see. Urbosa and Naburu, mainly Urbosa, are the stronger ones, but all of them are viable. So you can use any of them you want. It's completely up to you. I would recommend Urbosa or Naburu, but like I said, they're all viable, completely up to you. And very similar to the Zora, they have a very similar matchup spread. Very good matchups. They don't lose very hard to the high tiers, and they do very well against the other mid tiers and the low tiers. So let's talk about some of the cons. They really struggle to get food, as you see here. The Gerudos, the way that they gather and generate food by building pigs and then gathering from the pigs, sure, you're profiting, I think it's 100 food, because it costs 25 to build them, and they generate 125 food. So you're profiting 100, sure, but that takes a lot of time. So as you start to hit the mid and even the late game, you're not going to have that much food to build these big armies that you need to contend with the other factions. So it's a little difficult. So you're going to need to rely on a market a lot of the time, as you see here. I put this as a con because having to rely on a market to get a lot of resources sometimes is not very good, because you're hurting yourself a lot of the time. You're being very economically negative a lot of the time when you're having to use a market to do a lot of things. But sometimes you need it. So I wouldn't say the market is a crutch for the Gerudo's economy, but it is definitely something that you're going to need to help you out in those clutch situations in the mid and even the late game. They don't have very good siege units. It's not bad, but it's not amazing. The units are very squishy too, just like the Zora. And the last thing, very linear strategies. What I mean by this is there's not a lot of diversity to what the Gerudo can do to be viable, if that makes sense. So basically, the Gerudo are good. They're a very good faction. They're in the mid tier. They're a very good faction. But the thing is, there's only really one good way to play them, if that makes sense. The other ways aren't that strong. So when you're playing the Gerudo, you kind of know what they're going to go for most of the time, because that's what's good. Sure, they might not go for it, but whatever they're going for, if it's not the traditional fast expand, harassing and whatnot, it's very easy to counter, if that makes sense. So they're good with a specific type of strategy, and there are ways to counter that. So it's very linear and predictable, but it's still good, so just keep that in mind. So now I'll move on to low tiers. So the low tiers aren't bad per se. Okay, well, one of them is bad, and I was thinking about putting it in which is the Gorons, and I was thinking about putting them in a tier of their own, because they're just really, really bad. But the Kingdom of Hyrule I put here honestly just because they're just very average. They don't have that many weaknesses, but the thing is, they don't have that many strengths either. So I'll talk about them first, since I think they're, I guess you could say, the second worst in the game. So the Kingdom of Hyrule pros. This is gonna sound really funny, but their pros is that one of their pros is that they have very little cons. But you know, they're just a very balanced, just very basic faction. They don't have too much going for them in a good way and in a bad way. They have a very average economy. It's not amazing, but it's not the worst at all. Um, their mid and late game is actually pretty strong. I would say it's well um, above average, well above average for sure. It's not bad, but definitely, you know, not as strong as say like the Zora, or even their mid game is probably on par with maybe like the Kokiri. Um, all their heroes are really good. Zelda is definitely one of the stronger ones, and you're gonna want to go with her most of the time. Waru is definitely one of the weaker ones, but they're definitely all still viable and all still very good. Very strong siege units in the late game. You get their trebuchets and whatnot. Very good. Their units have really good survivability, unlike a lot of the other factions. Their knights and their cavalry and their castle guards and all them. They have a lot of health and they're very good at defending, and they're just very tanky. So that's a nice thing about them. Now, some of their cons, one of them being mainly, honestly, that none of their pros are like overly good. Like a lot of their pros are just average or above average, honestly. So that's a downside to them. Another one of the cons of this faction is they have a very bad early game. Um, it's very difficult for them to get past their early game if they're fighting, let's say, like the Goma. Against the Kokiri, it's doable, but they get really, really, really hard countered by the Goma, which is the next thing I was going to mention with the cons, is they get hard countered by the Goma. A Goma can Caretaker Rush, or even do a Spinal Pincer Rush, and most of the time beat the Hylian player, because Hyrule's early game is pretty mediocre. It's not very strong. But against a Kokiri, there are ways to survive, you know, a Deku Tree and Slinger Rush. There's ways around that. So let me talk about the last faction, and that is the Gorons. And this faction is... this faction's really bad. This faction's... I've been needing to rant about this faction for a little while now, because they're just really bad. But they do have a few pros. I will mention those first, of course. So they have a very strong late game. Once the Gorons hit the late game, they're actually really good. It's just a lot of their problems come from being able to reach that point. But once they do reach that point, they're actually pretty good. They have the best survivability, both in their units and in their buildings, of all the factions. They're very, very tanky, very durable. They have some of the best defenses in the game. Probably tied with the Zora, although maybe even a little bit better, because I know their bomb projectiles that they have from towers in their Civic Center, they do splash damage, so that's really nice to have. They have the best siege units in the game. So in late game, if your opponent's, you know, turtling and whatnot, you can just build a bunch of really good, you know, like rams or bomb tossers or anything. You know, they got a lot of good answers, and like the powder cake throwers, those are really good. They have a lot of good answers for turtley opponents. All the heroes are viable as the Gorons can get. Dangoro being one of the weaker ones, but the other three are pretty good. Their mid game is very average. It's not the best. It's better than the Goma, but that's not saying that much. So it's very average. So now the cons. Let me talk about these cons, because these cons are pretty big. So the first con to talk about with the Gorons is their poor economy. Their economy is garbage. The Gorons really struggle to get resources. Their workers are very, very bad at what they do. And that this doesn't help the fact that they have a poor economy, but all their units and buildings are very expensive. Like, they cost way too much ore and way too much materials. So it's very difficult to get a really good, you know, balance between economy and, you know, production with the Gorons, because you're going to struggle to have the resources to build these expensive things because your economy just sucks. And this is what I was mentioning earlier with the Gerudo. The Gerudo, they need a market is very good for them to have, but it's not a crutch and that they should like be focused on, and it's not something they have to win. With the Gorons, unfortunately, you have to have a market early in the game to be able to get those resources that you need to pump out the buildings and the units you need as early as possible. So that's really unfortunate that's the case with the Gorons. Another thing, their early game is practically non-existent. If you're playing the Gorons and you get rushed, a lot of the time, that's GG, honestly. They really don't have that many options for rushes. They can sometimes deal with, you know, the Deku Tree and Slinger rushes and pincers and spinals. They have ways around that. But a Caretaker rush, So the caretakers, they outrange the Goron's defenses. So the only thing the Gorons have going for them in the like the early phases as far as defense goes is the town center and the bombs that the town center throws out at enemies. But the caretakers outrange that. So the Gorons have no option against that, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So yeah, the early game is non-existent. Another con is that they have to be at tier 3 before they can mount any kind of viable offense. None of the Goron units that you get before tier 3 are very good at, like attacking at all. So it's just very, very difficult to be able to mount an offense before you hit this point in the game. Another thing too, slowest units in the game. This is you can't really do much about this because it's in the lore that the Gorons are slow, but it is something unfortunate that the Gorons have to deal with. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, so they lose most of the matchups in this game. The only matchup they go even in kind of is Hyrule, but even then, like that's still maybe slightly not in their favor. But generally speaking, they lose pretty much all these matchups. And they even have, this is what I was mentioning earlier about the Caretaker Rush. Okay, they have an unwinnable matchup, and that is the Goma. They can literally do nothing, and I mean nothing. They have zero options against a 5-minute Caretaker Rush. The Gorons have zero options. They can do nothing at all. It's very, very painful to watch. I'll have to upload a replay of it sometime on my channel, but it is painful to watch. The Gorons have zero options against that. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, that's pretty much all the cons about the Gorons. They're just not very good. Just no, it's not even like they're bad compared to the other factions. They're just bad in general. But I mean, I'm sure they'll get some nice buffs in the next patch. But anyway, so that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about as far as like the early, meta goes with these factions and whatnot. There's a lot of difference between like the high tiers and the low tiers at this point in the game. It's I wouldn't say it's super unbalanced, but it's kind of unbalanced. Mainly, the fact that the Kokiri and the Goma's early game is so strong as opposed to the other factions who have very weak early games. But anyway, that's all I want to talk about as far as this. I hope you guys enjoyed this type of video. I know I mostly do like gameplay stuff, but I just wanted to do some talking and stuff about what the game looks like right now, what's good, what's not, and why, and all that. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll probably do some more videos like this in the future, but I'll leave a link to my Discord like always in the description. Feel free to join that. We talk a lot about like strategies and the meta and just Zelda in general. So feel free to join that. I'd love to have you guys in there. I'll probably leave a link to this this little notes that I have right here. If you guys want to look over those if you have any interest. So if you have anything else to ask, feel free to ask in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next video.